explode with populations of sailors and Army personnel and naval people who were, loading and unloading ships. And so it became the lifeline. It was actually the only remaining line of supply from the United States to Australia. And there was a lot of concern about protecting that lifeline, because if the Japanese had managed to break it, we couldn't have reinforced Australia. And then MacArthur would never have had a base to work out of. I mean, it really would have changed the whole tenor of the war early on if the Japanese had managed to break that lifeline. And the Kangaroo Squadron was a pretty critical part of that early effort.
Can you describe some of their early missions? You mentioned that they went on missions in New England, which is, I think, near Papua New Guinea, and we're practically hugging the Australian coastline at this point. So what were those early missions like?
Yeah, it was actually New Britain.
Oh, New Britain. Okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
New England, that's a little bit different.
Right. Yeah, it was the island of New Britain, which you're correct, is very close to the big island of New Guinea. And it's all part of what the Australians called the New Guinea Territory. Rabaul was the capital, a big port surrounded by volcanic mountains. The Japanese had captured that. So the Kangaroo Squadron's first bombing mission was to attack that harbor, a place called Simpson Harbor, which they attempted to do on the night of February 22nd and 23rd of 1942 with very limited success. I mean, you could hardly even think of anything that came out of that first mission that was successful, other than the fact that most of the bombers that attempted it completed the mission, but the numbers were really small. We're talking about only 5 bombers managed to get up over the target, which is kind of ludicrous when you think about it. And then one of those didn't make it back to the refueling stop. It ended up landing in a swamp in New Guinea out of fuel. And it later became a very famous relic called the Swamp Ghost. And the story of the Kangaroo Squadron and the Swamp Ghost are intertwined. It was part of the squadron, lost on its first mission. The crew had a really epic survival story in the jungle for 5 weeks. And then some 70 years after the plane was lost in the swamp, it was actually recovered. And now it's back in the United States territory. It's at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum in Hawaii on display. And it's a very rare early model B-17E that, again, participated in that very first American mission to Rabaul and then made a belly landing short of fuel trying to get to its refueling stop.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Well, I have to ask about the 9 crew members surviving that, because if anyone knows anything about Papua New Guinea, they think of anthropologists or missionaries who go to cannibal tribes. So I think they all survived. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep.
Can you just describe that a little bit about the 5 weeks that they survived? What do they deal with? How do they get rescued?
Their first 4 days were by far the most difficult and challenging and almost fatal for them, because the plane came down, it made a smooth belly landing because the pilot thought it looked like a field of wheat, and other men in the cockpit had the same opinion. So he saw this, which is unusual in New Guinea. It's a very mountainous island. So to find a place that was flat and level and looked like a wheat field was heaven sent for these guys who were about to run out of gas. So the pilot puts the plane down without any real difficulty with the wheels retracted. And they notice immediately that they've sunk down into this really tall grass. They emerge from the plane and they find themselves in the midst of this swamp of kunai grass that's growing 12 or 15 feet high. It's towering over the belly landed bomber. And there are 3 or 4 feet of water, surrounding the airplane with this thick grass grown out of it. and they can't see much except in one direction. They can see a few trees way off in the distance, a few miles in the distance. And so they realize they're basically in no man's land with no survival equipment to speak of, hardly any water, no appreciable food. And they tried to hike. Well, they did make it out of the swamp, but they had to hike out of the swamp using machetes to cut their way out through this grass, which has razor sharp edges. It's very, very thick and stout. And the grass is so sharp, as a matter of fact, that it just cuts flesh. So their hands were cut up, their legs were cut up, their forearms were sliced. And to try to walk and swing a machete and hack at this grass meant that they were moving just inches at a time. So it took them 4 days and nights of wading in this sometimes waist deep, sometimes neck deep swamp with innumerable insects, mosquitoes and leeches and scorpions, and they can hear the splashes of what turns out to be crocodiles at night. Just terrible, terrible environment. And they almost perished. If they hadn't found their way out of the swamp within another 12 or 18 hours, they probably wouldn't have made it. But as luck would have it, they come onto some firm ground on the fourth day. They get out of the swamp in terrible condition and then stumble on a couple of Papua New Guinea natives who are chopping what's called pith out of a coconut palm. They eat this stuff. And so they come across these natives chopping a fallen palm tree, and the natives are terrified and run away into the woods. But a few minutes later, the curiosity, I guess, gets the better of them, and they come out, and these 9 bedraggled Americans and 2 scared natives are trying to sign language to each other and trying to communicate with each other and not having much luck. But eventually, the pilot, Fred Eaton, and some of his guys convince these 2 natives that they're just lost and really, really hungry. And the natives lead them to a little village. And from there, they're taken to a little bit bigger establishment where there's a place where they can rest overnight. And then their real journey begins when they meet an Australian. He's basically a patrol officer, a kind of quasi-military patrol officer, real classic Aussie who's been living in the jungle, and he's running a mission, not a religious mission, but what's called the Boona mission, which is his government station. And he's a government employee and basically rescues these guys, takes them up to his government station, feeds them for a while, and then gets them in touch with an Anglican mission that has nurses and a little hospital, and they get better care there for a few weeks. Their overall journey was about 650 miles, mostly by boat, some of it by foot, and it took 5 weeks for them to get basically 100 miles from where their plane came down to the Australian capital of Port Moresby in New Guinea. The plane was 110 miles from Port Moresby, but it took them 5 weeks because of the enormous mountains that occupy the center of the island. And the only way to get there was to go the long way around basically the entire Papuan Peninsula. So their trip ended up being 650 miles and taking them weeks just to get back to the place that they were supposed to go get gas on their first mission.
Wow. And that's just one crew of this whole squadron. So there's
one
a lot.
Crew. That's right.
A lot going on there. Totally.
I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's just one crew story out of this very unique squadron. And you may have been intending to segue into this anyway, but the squadron then went on to fly a bunch of other really interesting special missions, rescuing MacArthur from the Philippines and flying some important raid type missions out of the Philippines, and some other things that they were basically just bridging the gap until more American forces and reinforcements arrived in Australia. For weeks, they were the only American combat outfit that was doing anything, and they were the only bombing squadron that was doing anything in that part of the country. I mean, in that part of the world.
I'm really curious about their missions, but before that, one thing you mentioned that they were flying an early B-17. You had mentioned, and World War II aficionados know how bad the American military was before World War II. And it takes well over a year after Pearl Harbor before the industrial machine is cranking out the technology that really puts America on equal or even superior footing to the Japanese to the east and the Germans to the west. So in these early years, I mean, I imagine this antiquated technology going up against the latest in Japanese avionics. So are they at a disadvantage when the Kangaroo Squadron crews are going on these bombing missions with older aircraft, or are they doing well for themselves comparatively?
Interesting question. The short answer is they do comparatively well for themselves, because actually the model of the B-17 that they were flying, the early E model, was the latest version available. It had only been around since September of 1941. So they were flying brand new B-17s with the tail guns and the upper turret, those were new from the earlier versions of the B-17. So they had better defensive armament. But they were also learning basically every combat lesson that could be learned in the B-17. They were having to learn the hard way, just by experimental usage. For example, they discovered on that first mission to Rabaul that even with what they called a long-range auxiliary tank in one bomb bay, on one side of the bomb bay and a bomb load on the other side, they barely had enough gas to complete that mission, which is around 1,600 miles in length. So a lot of the lessons they learned had to just be figured out. There was no manual, no guidebook for them early on. The B-17E early models had a remote belly turret that made them quite unique. Only the first 112, I believe that's the right number, only the first 112 of the first B-17Es had that remote turret. And then it was so unpopular and so ineffective that the ball turret, the famous ball turret, was incorporated afterwards in all the subsequent B-17s. So these guys were dealing with this really awkward belly turret that had prismatic mirrored sighting, and the gunner had to lie prone in the belly of the plane facing aft, looking through this mirrored system. And evidently a lot of the gunners would get airsick because, of course, the plane was maneuvering, and here they were facing backwards, having to mentally compensate to correct for the mirror image. And it was just funky. It was just a experimental, not an experimental design. It was a production design, but nobody had really tried it in combat, and it turned out to be ineffective. So they had to deal with that kind of thing. These were the first tail gunners in B-17s to see action. So they had to learn what the tail guns could do, and the Japanese respected those for a while. They learned not to attack B-17s from the rear because the tail gunners would drive them off. So it was a little bit of the learning curve on both sides. I would say the big disadvantage maybe was that the bombers were flying all of their missions without any escort whatsoever. We didn't have a fighter plane that could get up that high at that time that was in the theater. The B-17 could fly in the high 20s or even low 30,000 feet flight levels. And we didn't have any fighters that could escort them either through the necessary range or the necessary service ceiling. And they were facing top Japanese pilots flying the Zero, Japan's famous naval fighter. That's what was